If we can prove that the wool comes from Montana, if we can tell them that the fabric was made in Stafford and the garment was made upstairs, that's a beautiful story. You are consuming more local than you probably have in the last year by buying our product.
Just a quick reminder for you to like, subscribe, and rate this podcast so we can get your feedback and know how to make it better.
Hey, it's Ari. Welcome to another episode of the Made in America podcast. Today, I'm with Jacob Long, president of American Woolen. Jacob, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely my pleasure. Jake, it's this Made in America podcast, so we always start off with the same two questions. What do you make and why do you make it?
So American Woolen is a designer and manufacturer of New England-inspired, fine worsted, and luxurious woolen cloth. So in effect, we make fabric for textiles. Textiles go into apparel. Textiles go into home furnishings. Textiles can go into industrial applications. Our business is more focused on apparel. Why do I do it? What started off as an idea has actually become more of a quest. And I tell people we do it because we want to build communities. In my area, the mill built the town, and the town supported the mill. If I can do what I can do to support the town and we can really develop the town, I've succeeded.
It's really an amazing story. And I think we've got so much interesting stuff to talk about, your background, your vision, what you're trying to do, what apparel this goes into, and just the concept around what's happened. I mean, a lot of people know that textiles used to be big in New England and that sort of shifted. And I think your view on that is really, really interesting. But I really always like to start with sort of the origin story and sort of how you got going. And you haven't always been in manufacturing, and you haven't always been, I guess you've always been using apparel, but you haven't always been into manufacturing apparel. So can you share with the audience sort of how did you get involved in American Woolen? I mean, the company certainly predates you.
Correct.
But maybe tell the origin story. How did you get involved?
I spent 20 years working in Europe in investment banking. And after that, I went down to Italy to work in consumer good manufacturing. And I tell people my takeaway from that 25-year experience abroad really made me realize what craft manufacturing is. So I tend to think that where American manufacturing is all about scale and about process, I learned that the Europeans are obsessed by product. And process and product come together.
Why is that, do you think? Where does that differential come from?
So I like to think that the way the Europeans look at a product, that there's 4 salient attributes to all products, 4 salient attributes: materials, material integrity, branding, design, and manufacture. A table stands on 4 legs. The Americans put far more emphasis on design and branding and less on material integrity and manufacture. What does that mean? Most apparel manufacturers in America make product in Sri Lanka with polyester. Where I'd argue the Europeans are obsessed by wool, cotton, fine linen, and silk, and they make it in a local atelier in Paris.
And what is from a consumer perspective, why do you think that European consumers want that differential? Or is it an education level? Because when you say it and you describe it, I'm sort of imputing in my own mind this style, the European style as you described it, is really about sort of I don't know if it's couture, but craftsmanship, fine materials, probably has a really luxurious feel to it. It's probably also going to be more expensive, whereas sort of the polyester factory made is going to have a bit of a more, I don't know what the right terminology is, but sort of a lesser luxurious feel. But that means that the consumer has agreed to make the trade-off, probably spend a little bit more to get that. Where do you think that comes from?
Ari, I think if you look in history, it's always been about how manufacturing back in the 18th and 19th century was about a specialty item. The Americans were able to commoditize that specialty. And I tell everybody, my real job is just turn a commodity back into a specialty. And I would argue that's how the Europeans view consumer products as specialties. To say that everybody needs to spend a certain amount of money on a pair of trousers and or a shirt is probably false. I would argue that there are different categories, but I think the Europeans probably treat that commodity item as a specialty. And a lot of it, in my mind, it's kind of crazy, goes back to traditions. Consumer products is probably the only item you're going to find that has a local tradition tied to it. And if anybody doubts it, look at craft beer. The craft beer industry did a lot about local traditions. Point being is, craft beer industry did more for local employment and local traditions than any massive Bud or Coors facility did over the last 30 years.
Right. Difference between, say, like a Bud Light or a Bud Heavy and like a New England style IPA,
Correct.
right? Which, you know, even if you're a craft brewer in California, you might make a New England style IPA.
Correct.
But it won't have the same New England hops, the same sort of tradition.
Exact materials,
Right.
branding, design, manufacture. It all
Right.
goes back to those four salient attributes. And I think that's where people really went off on a different tangent when it became the commoditization of specialties. Many people have to argue why. You got to remember, France went from 30 million people in the 17th century to 60 million people. America went from 5 to 335 million people. In such a large growth, it was no doubt that America was going to commoditize basic items.
Just sort of out of necessity.
Out of necessity.
You couldn't craft manufacture enough underwear or whatever to meet the demand.
Exactly. But I think what we're trying to do at American Woolen is, can we take that commodity and make it specialty through those four attributes that I highlighted earlier?
When you we're going to get to that. I want to just circle back to the origin story for just a second. So you were in investment banking and then you went to consumer products manufacturing. How did you make that sort of leap? What made you decide to get out of the banking sector?
I always start the discussion with, I'm not the smartest chap in the room, but I have the passion and enthusiasm that probably overrules my intelligence. A lot of it was just one door led to another door, and that door led to more doors. Somebody I think I met one night, who was an ex-colleague of mine, was mentioning that their client had this textile mill in Connecticut. I was living in Milan at the time, in Italy. My wife's Italian. And that introduction, that drink, went on to 3 more drinks. And that evening, I found myself at home furiously trying to set up a meeting with this client that owned and operated this textile mill in Connecticut. 4 mill tours later, 50 hours of consultants later, and 6 months of work trying to build a coalition to invest in the mill. And I bought a mill in Connecticut.
There you go, from Milan to Stafford Springs.
Milan to Stafford
the classic
Springs.
growing up story.
Exactly.
So you're sitting in Milan, you got this opportunity. What is it that could have captured your imagination? Was it your appreciation for textiles? Was it the story of the mill in Stafford Springs? Was it the history, all the above? Like, what do you remember what sort of captured your imagination?
I think you said all of the above. It was that period of time, 2012, 2013, where Made in America was kind of going off from food and beverage into textiles and apparel. And I always tell everybody, investment banking did teach me a lot. And a big thing was that food and beverage tend to be leading indicators for other consumer goods. And at that time, I was looking at what the mill could do. And I kind of go back to the mill. The mill was owned and operated by an Italian company that got sold to Louis Vuitton, the French luxury good conglomerate. The mill is a sterling example of how a wool textile mill should be put together. So it wasn't just buying a mill in Connecticut. It was essentially buying America and Canada's finest mill, which made me realize that this mill had potential that far exceeded what I actually knew even when I walked in. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is we're the only mill in America and Canada that can produce anything from an 8-ounce fabric for shirting to a 38-ounce fabric for heavy upholsteries. So we kind of really covered the gamut. I don't know if you know, from 125 wool mills in America, we have 3.
There's only 3?
3. And by the same token, there are over 60 wool mills in Italy, 5 wool mills in France, 11 wool mills in England, and many, many, many wool mills in China. And so belief, for me, it was, there's something that doesn't work. And so let's try to attack the problem head on.
So it's shocking to me that there's 20 times more wool mills in Little Italy. And I don't mean, little in any other sense than just geographically small Italy compared to how much just geography there is in the United States. It's unbelievable.
A lot of it is how the mills are structured. I go back to my earlier comment. European textile mills can operate at a fraction that an American textile mill was used to operating at. I think it's a European approach, and it kind of goes back to the craft beer analysis. The craft beer industry created a huge industry of a more distributed manufacturing base. As you know, in America, it's about scale, and scale means a lot of people, under one roof, producing a commodity item. The Europeans are able to be very profitable with 24 employees and a relatively scaled down operation. So when I say the word 60, when I say the number 60, that metric is probably, you're thinking metric as in 60 large 200,000 square foot facilities in Italy. It's far from it, but it shows you what's possible.
So I mean, the history of American Woolen, I mean, it dates back to the mid 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. So, and I don't know how much you know about it, but if as much as you can share, sort of what has been the trajectory of the lifestyle of that mill? Because I presume it got caught up in the mass manufacturing push that everyone else got into and must have gotten out of it, or what's sort of the trajectory from 1850 or whatever to 2013?
I think a lot of it was, so the mills we occupy I didn't buy a wool textile mill. I bought a wool textile campus.
Okay.
So we have 3 mills that comprise the whole operation.
Okay.
And each of the mills,
Speaking of scale.
Exactly. Well, there you go. But 2 of the mills date from the 1850s. And another mill dates from 1970. And these 3 mills are all located in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. But a big part of it was, even during that downtrend, a lot of the work that the Italian parent did was to focus on better design. And so again, those 4 legs that I mentioned for a product, I would argue that the Italian owners and operators of the mill before I stepped in were obsessed by the quality of materials and the design. And so in effect, the mill had a very good book of business with the usual suspects in this world: Brooks Brothers, Men's Warehouse Group, Dillard's, Nordstrom's. So the mill was always able to operate even through the downtrend because they focused on design and material integrity. And again, those 4 legs, a lot of people talk about them, but if you understand and evaluate what it really means, you could actually understand how the Italians succeeded where maybe others failed.
Yeah, they took a totally different approach and got there. So it's interesting. So I guess I would have thought there'd be a middleman between sort of American Woolen and Nordstrom, but Nordstrom buys the materials, finished product, or they're buying sort of the wool to make their own product?
So I effectively make a piece of fabric that is 55 yards long and 60 inches wide. I sell my fabric directly to garment manufacturers, either here or abroad, that then will cut that fabric and make garments. An interesting thing about what we do is, although we sell our fabric to these downstream retailers, in effect, we provide a mill label to the garment manufacturer that when you open your sport coat, you can see a mill label. And what it does is it provides justification for the investment that went into the product. So oftentimes, a Nordstrom is very pleased to have a mill label made in Italy, made in America, and it sells better than maybe made in a third world country. Gotcha. So in effect, we've been very fortunate to kind of be on that mill label type of business.
Ah, gotcha. And so I mean, listen, you're an investment banker. I know you probably you mentioned all the consultants and whatnot. I'm sure you've got spreadsheets and metrics and growth targets, margin improvements. Like, how do you think about managing? How did you think about starting to manage and grow the business, and how has that gone in the 8 years you've been at it?
So 2 questions, 2 answers. Yeah. First question was, we purchased the mill assets, no book of business. So in effect, we started at 0 back in 2014. And I'll save you the casualties and the blood and everything and all the cadavers and everybody. As somebody said to me the other day, being an entrepreneur is like throwing yourself off a building. Yeah. And I would only say it's been a struggle. It's been 8 years of pain, but I do tell people it's been a huge learning experience. I would argue that we probably had a bad business model. We've changed that business model, and I think it's just being an entrepreneur and trying to weave and mend and trying to understand how to get out of that. I'm pretty happy to say that even after COVID, we've rebuilt the business, and I guess it's just through tenacity and dedication that we continue to maintain the mill. So we're definitely on a different tangent today, but it has been anything but easy.
Really?
Having said that, I'm sitting here on Friday, and I can tell you it's been a wonderful adventure. I just maybe feel sorry for my family members who've had to suffer through it with me. the highs and the lows on entrepreneurship.
Tell me about it. We could get a drink now and go off of that for sure. What you said, you talked about sort of pivoting the business model. What has been the pivot, and how have you found your stride?
So I think the big pivot really came when we realized that we're not just a textile mill in Connecticut. We are a purveyor of fine New England-inspired textiles. And it kind of goes back to that earlier comment about traditions. I would say that in that first part of the business, call it chapter 1, we tried to take off from the previous owner and operator. And in effect, we were trying to do textiles for suiting sport coats and trousers that maybe had a European color palette, maybe a European styling. And it made me realize that we're a New England mill. We're New England's last mill. We should put all of our energy and all of our effort into trying to rediscover that New England aesthetic. And although it may, for those who are not very interested or don't really know a lot about textiles, it may be far-fetched, but there is a color palette, the flora and fauna of Vermont, the flora and fauna of Maine. I tell everybody, the Maine coastline in January is a slate gray you'll never find in any other place. We capture that color palette in our textile. Chapter 1 was trying to understand what the downstream clients were buying. Chapter 2 is discovering that what we are and projecting that to the market. And that's been a whole different type of business.
And is the market responding and opening to that? Like, is it sort of innately received? How does that, I'm trying to connect how.
Ari, it's a lot of moving parts in every sort of puzzle, in every sort of business venture. The moving parts here have not only been what we want to do, it's how our downstream clients have changed. I tell everybody I spent the first chapter beating down the door up and down the streets of New York City, targeting the major brands that everyone's familiar with. It's like today I'm now targeting smaller companies that put Made in America front and center in their value proposition. Mm-hmm. And I tell everybody in the past, I spent my days up and down New York. Now I have clients in Ironwood, Michigan, Austin, Texas, Nashville, Tennessee, Minneapolis, Minnesota, anywhere but New York City. And a lot of it is the industry that I cater to has kind of changed in the sense of the major retailers based in New York are losing out to the smaller retailers with a more focused type of approach with their clients. Not targeting the massive consumers, but targeting tribes of collectors, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. And so where would people find your products today?
We work with a lot of outdoor retailer brands. Brands you may have heard of, Stormy Cromer, famous for a Stormy Cromer hat. Mm-hmm. We work with some hunting brands, Weather Wool, for example, Forlow. We do work with Brooks Brothers. I guess I'm pleased to say we are doing the fabric for the Ralph Lauren Design Team USA that the athletes will be wearing in Paris 2024. So I think a lot of our work in the future could be more targeting maybe a Ralph Lauren. But a lot of the work we do also, from just focusing on apparel, we now work with interiors, we work with craft. So even on that aspect, we've kind of broadened our focus to basically, if you're using wool, you should be talking to me. As opposed to if you're wearing apparel based in wool, you should be talking to me.
Fascinating. Tell me a little bit about your view around the idea of embracing the New England aesthetic. Like you've talked about it, you talked about the mill being part of the town and sort of embracing that. How do you think about continuing to embrace it? I was really inspired by that slate gray coast of Maine in January. Honestly, I was like, wow, that's a pretty cool story. How do you continue to embrace that and maybe educate the market about what is unique about it, because I think it can be a challenge in every business, which is almost helping the consumer to know that this is even possible.
Our job at American Woolen is to build a community. If we could build a community around this New England aesthetic, we've accomplished one of our many goals we've set out to ourselves. But a big part of this is how are we able to convince a downstream consumer the beauties of New England? And again, it's back to that craft beer analogy. By focusing on local and by focusing on local traditions, we can educate a regional, national, international clientele on the traditions that make New England famous. Again, the momentum behind American Woolen is to build the textile mill, but it's also to try to lift New England, lift Connecticut. We're a Connecticut-based mill. We're a Stafford Springs-based mill. For us, it's kind of broadcasting that aesthetic to a global audience. And global could be Tokyo. It could be Korea, some of these countries. So a lot of it is working to try to understand what that means, and through marketing and through conversation and fluid dialogue, get these consumers to understand New England. Because in effect, we're lifting New England up for people around New England.
Absolutely, absolutely. What lessons do you take? We talked about a little bit in the beginning of the episode about what you saw in Europe, and we've talked about some of that small mills and some of the traditions. I wonder, as you continue to go through the journey and you think about how to lift up New England and thinking about that, and so you came from Milan. I don't know if you could find a more fashion-centric city in the entire globe. I wonder what you take from your time in Europe, maybe your time in Italy specifically. What lessons you learned about how to make a place and a clothing kind of start to connect together and learn from that experience?
You know, the way Europe is based around a guild system to a large extent, and the guild system actually dominated America even through the 1930s. I think at American Woolen, our approach is, in effect, the guild system. How can we focus on, I make a textile. My textile goes to an upholstery maker and or a garment manufacturer. Chapter 3 of American Woolen is once we're able to combine those elements and actually make our own garments and, in effect, create an ecosystem. Europe is chock-a-block of these ecosystems. So it's the ability to, let's say, share the knowledge synergies, call them knowledge spillovers that happen in our industry. Point being, if I'm not talking to the garment manufacturer, I can't take heed of his comments or criticisms of my fabric. If he's upstairs and I'm dining with him on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, we're talking the same language. How can I work with a New England-based garment manufacturer to make the most New England of New England garment? Well, it requires a New England textile. If my garment manufacturer is somewhere off in another part of the country, I have no idea what he's trying to achieve. Working together, we can achieve more. So I think the European approach has always been about building around these ecosystems. A lot of it is place-based economic development back from the 18th century, the 19th century.
Yeah, what's old is new again.
What's old is new again.
So the idea would be, it would be sort of in stage 3 is maybe even bring it in-house or on the campus, someone who's actually going to use the product that you make to make the end product, so that the collaboration is just so much tighter and closer together.
Happening this fall.
Oh, well, look at that. Coming soon to a theater near you. And then,
Correct.
so would it be sold under the American Woolen brand?
No, we're going to start off with working with clients who really like this. And a lot of this goes back to that whole environmental footprint. If you don't know, the textile and apparel industry is notorious for its labor practices and also the environmental footprint. Statistics vary, but I think between 7 and 10% of global greenhouse emissions are caused by our industry. By taking out the transport element and just having the fabric local, we've done a great deal. I'm not going to mention the name, but let's just say there's a very famous retailer, which you probably all know. They have a blazer that they're now presenting to the market. That blazer has traveled 25,000 miles to get from the designer and the manufacturer to you.
How is that even possible? Where is it going? It just goes back and forth from one place to another. Is it the dyes? What is
this?
that?
Is truly the way these supply chains have been built over the last 20 to 30 years. Let's just assume that all business models need to be revisited. The business model through the 1950s and 60s was about local. The business model started in the 1980s and 90s was searching out for the cheapest price possible. That created these extensive supply chains. And you got to understand how they view it. If you're a designer sitting in New York and you have mills and garment manufacturers globally offering you possibilities, it's the kid in a candy store. Our goal has been different. We try to reduce that and make it that the new business model could be local. To go back to your inquiry, the wool starts in Australia. The wool goes in a ship to Italy. The mill takes that fiber and turns it into fabric. That fabric is shipped all the way over to China. The China makes the garment. That garment is then put into a container and goes to Long Beach. In Long Beach, it's picked up in a trailer, and the trailer comes to New York City or Hartford. I've done the 25,000
They've done the 25,000 miles, and it's been on a plane, a train, a boat, a truck.
Mode of transportation possible.
My goodness. And so it's just kind of going back to this idea of like bringing it back to local again.
Correct.
And do you think that given the just the cost of transportation, the increasing costs of labor in all parts of the world, that's helping to make it more economical, or make that, you mentioned the thing on the 90s, and everyone's seen this in the 80s and 90s, the search for like save every penny to go to, Malaysia, Taiwan, China, whatever. Is the cost arbitrage just not there anymore, that doing it local again can make sense?
I think a lot of it is not about consuming more, but consuming better. I tell everybody it's kind of hard to argue that any American consumer doesn't have enough.
Yeah, that's fair. Very, very fair.
Nobody can walk into their closet and think, I just don't have enough apparel.
Yeah.
But I think the big argument for us is, how do you consume better? And again, when I grew up in the 1970s, nobody even thought you could pay more than 50 cents for a can of beer. Today we're paying $10 for a bottle of beer. So I think a lot of people, can we consume better? Yes. If the story is there, if the material integrity is there, and if those four legs are standing, you'll pay the price. Or at least you're more inclined to understand why you're paying a price. If we can prove that the wool comes from Montana, if we can tell them that the fabric was made in Stafford and the garment was made upstairs, that's a beautiful story. You are consuming more local than you probably have in the last year by buying our product. So at the end of the day, it really is that's the challenge. To answer your question on the environmental footprint, I can't tell you exactly about the cost, but I can say the environmental cost is far less.
Far less. Yeah. Well, and it all, by the way, comes back to the quality, right? I mean, you're not spending the, $7 for the can of New England style IPA if the product coming out of the can is this, no disrespect to Budweiser, but it's the same thing as you're getting out of a can of Bud Heavy, right? I mean, you're just not going to spend the $7. I think the question is, and this is a personal connection for me, so I fully get it. I don't know what the market research says about everybody else, but I've long been a believer in, I'd rather have fewer items that are of higher quality that will last than just get more and more disposable stuff that just ends up taking up space and not being there. And I feel like, and again, it's back to a feeling, I feel like my life is richer because of it. And you start to appreciate it's the stitching in the leather of your car, or, the stitching on your jacket, or, like I've just gotten some very nice jackets recently, and the buttons on the sleeves are on an angle. Like, and I just find, to me, every time I put it on, I feel better, and I take care of it, because I'm not buying 4 of these jackets every year,
A big part of it is that. And a lot of it is just looking at the quality of the merchandise. It's hard to argue that even other countries like China, Chinese make fantastic garments. China in 2023, it's not about quality, is kind of in this whole criteria on your buying standards. It's hard you can find inferior quality, but you can find top quality made in all 4 corners of the globe. I think the big thing at American Woolen is not so much the quality, but bringing it all together. If we continue to think that textiles and apparel is a low value-added industrial system, then that's where the investment's going to go. But I think the Europeans have proven to us that textiles and apparel can be considered a high value economic system. Point being, when people are paying $900 for a pair of spaghetti strap high heels, you may think it's all design and branding. Material integrity is huge, and the manufacturer is fantastic. And I would argue that the market for expensive top coats, expensive shoes, expensive handbags, yes, there is a lot of design and there is a lot of marketing that kind of adds to that cost premium, but there is also material integrity in that cost premium. It's not plastic.
No, you're
number one.
1,000% right on
And
that.
I think a lot of that is what we're trying to do at American Woolen. I mean, I tell people, material integrity. We buy our wool from Wyoming. We don't buy wool. We buy Wyoming wool. We buy Montana wool. Knowing that there are growers upstream who are spending their time to be a rancher and to try to understand how to increase their wool yield, we're working directly with them. Truly, this is from upstream to downstream. I'm going to say one thing that kind of made me realize just how wacky this world is. Upstream, America has 5 million sheep that graze our lovely prairies. Downstream, these 5 million sheep generate 22 million pounds of wool a year.
5 million sheep, 22 million pounds
of wool a year.
Really?
Yeah. Down 78% of that wool clip goes to China.
Stop it.
78% of the current American wool clip goes to China.
Well, that's how we get 25,000 miles, because we shear the sheep here, ship the wool over there to make it, ship it, send it back. Yeah.
Downstream, the American consumer imports $5 billion of wool, textiles, and apparel a year. From the upstream bountiful harvest to the downstream strong demand, the lack of a viable midstream element has prevented, in my mind, the creation of billions. I'm going to say economic value, but Ari, we kind of got to go back while we're here. Economic and social value. Mm-hmm. The physical and social assets in place in Stafford Springs is the reason that we went into this whole venture at American Woolen. It's not just about the economics of the venture, it's also the social aspect and the social assets, the 45 employees who come in every day to do what they do. In my mind, we can release billions in value if we focus on that midstream, that viability, and make that midstream link viable.
How will you know if the consumer is responding? Like, are there macro trends? Like you were talking earlier about the integrity and the people spending money on the straps. And it reminded me of experience I had this past holiday season. And I went to the mall to buy a gift, and I was floored by how many people were in the Louis Vuitton store buying handbags.
It's good or bad?
It's good. I think I just thought to myself, my gosh, I never would have known the demand for high end and quality. Like I knew it was there, but it was the united colors of Benetton in this store: age, race, style. I mean, the width and depth and height of the different people buying, $1,000 handbags was shocking to me. And it just opened my eyes that, this thing I said to you before about my desire to buy higher quality, less stuff to experience it must be broader than just me. And so I just didn't know if I'm maybe connecting some dots here, but are those things that you see and think that shows a path for American Woolen into the future?
Yes.
Ask a long question with a very easy answer.
I mean, look, are there metrics that we look at to understand what we're doing? Yeah, I've given you 2 metrics. I've given you 3 metrics right there. I've given you 5 million sheep, 78%, and $5 billion. If we can increase that 5 million sheep, reduce that 78% that goes to China, and reduce that $5 billion of imported wool, textiles, and apparel, I've done my job.
Yes, sir.
What I can tell you is that post-COVID, it's been a definitely change in our business in the sense of more people are calling in than we're calling out. I think that shows that maybe our strategy of focusing on that upstream element. And Ari, I work at a textile mill, but my job is connecting the dots. Mm-hmm. Connecting the dots literally means going to Laramie, Wyoming, talking to a wool grower and telling him, don't send your wool overseas. I have a buyer downstream that wants it. Calling the brand in Nashville, Tennessee. Hi, do you want to buy wool fabric and it's made in Wyoming and I can do a source verified wool fiber story? Yes.
Nice.
Because finally they have the marketing material to prove what they're doing is right.
Get it done.
Make sense?
That does make sense. I wonder something. When you're out in Wyoming at a sheep rancher's place, do you ever look around and go, my gosh, it's a far cry from investment banking in Paris? I mean, do you ever think about that? Does it ever just strike you like?
What it does is I think it takes you out of your element that where you may have been a cog in a machine, you're now the machine. That makes sense? I was a cog. I may have been a highly compensated cog, but I was a cog. I would argue that today I am trying to work with my staff to become the machine. And I think that's taken a different approach. Obviously, as somebody told me walking through the mill yesterday, you probably could have been earning 5 times more money than you are today. Yes. You probably wouldn't have the amount of gray hair you do today. Yes. Are you still married? Yes. At the end of the day, I think a lot of it is, but rather than being the cog, trying to build the machine and be the machine is something that I never thought about. And I guess that type of return on investment overrules anything else.
Yeah, it's super hard to quantify. So on that topic, I wonder how has been, forgetting the whole marketing and the challenges of just running a business in general, but just the idea of making something versus investing in something for a return? How did that play out in terms of your vision? A lot of people I talk to that come from other industries and have gone to manufacturing have just an idea of, oh my God, it's going to be so nice to take something and make it into something else, have a tangible output. We haven't talked about it, but I presume maybe you had some of that sort of vision in your mind of, I'm going to make something and it's going to be in my hand. And I just wonder, how has that journey from sort of spreadsheets and computers to, buying and selling a tangible product, how has that been for you? And has it been a positive experience?
It's been a wonderful experience to understand what we're doing. I always tell people I invested in a wine company some years ago in Italy, and probably my proudest moment was not sitting in some investment banking dealing room, but actually going to dinner with some friends and seeing that bottle of wine on the wine list. The pride that goes into making a product is amazing. I would argue that for me to do what we're doing today, to actually work with something more tangible, I understand why I'm doing what I do. That makes sense.
100%.
I told you it's chapter 1, chapter 2, but I said the true validation of what I'm doing is you open one door. Life's about doors. And I tell everybody, you open one door, you close one door, and either I'm onto something that's good or I should be a door salesman at Home Depot. Because in effect, I've opened one door that led to another door, and that door led to more doors. And then another door was the Wyoming Wool Initiative at the University of Wyoming. These doors have opened up more doors. I didn't experience that same thing in investment banking. I didn't. Others may have. I didn't.
Well, they're not here to talk about it, Jacob. We're interested in your individual experience. And you brought up that you're still married, which is fantastic. How has your wife felt about the journey from Italy to the United States?
I can only say my wife has been my biggest supporter to date. When things are really down, she was the first one to support me. Rather than being a textile mill operator, consider just being an entrepreneur. On this entrepreneurial journey, and a lot of people wonder, are you born an entrepreneur? Do you become an entrepreneur? Is it desperation that makes us entrepreneurs? It's all of the above. I would say there's a big part of desperation in that, but I would say that through this whole venture, she has supported me 100%, economically and emotionally. Again, it's not been easy, but in terms of what I need to do to get the job done, she's behind me 100%.
That's fantastic. And I'll tell you, I have a very similar experience with my wife, and there's nothing better than having that sort of support at home. It's absolutely crucial going through this journey. Jacob, I'm going to just ask you some wrap-up questions as we kind of wind it down. So my first question is, you're clearly extremely passionate about what you're doing, but my question is, if you had to do something other than be president of American Woolen, and it could be anything, what would you do with your time?
I'd be playing clarinet in the Boston Common to make money.
Ooh, a little busking. I like it. Do you have a favorite business book?
No, I don't.
Thinking about your trajectory and all the experiences that you've had, can you think of some lessons that you've had early in your life or early in your career that help propel you to all the success you've had?
Well, first off, let's say that I can't say I've had success. I can actually say I've had a lot of ups and downs. I think success is a far word. You know what, Ari? A big thing is try to be useful. And I would have argued that maybe in my past career, I wasn't as useful as I am now. Whether I'm using an expression to connect the dots, I'm connecting the dots. And it's not that I'm connecting the dots. I'm getting off my seat, getting on a flight to Denver, going up to Wyoming, talking to the wool rancher, and then calling a client downstream. I think maybe for me to be useful is exactly what I'm trying to do. And so in my mind, the more useful I can become toward building American Woolen, toward building up Stafford Springs, toward building up Connecticut, which is part of New England, that's basically what I'm trying to achieve.
And what's something, Jacob, that you learned later in your life or later in your career that if you could go back and tell young Jacob this thing that you learned, you think it'd be a real positive impact on his life?
Don't lose perspective.
Say more.
Don't lose perspective, because so often you just don't see in front of you. You're so obsessed by the moment, you can't take the time to sit back try to understand what's happening. And I think once you understand that, maybe we'll all be there one time looking back on our lives and then connecting those dots to ourselves. But I think if I would have been, 20, 30 years ago, I think fear drives so much of our decision making. And if you can kind of put that fear aside and realize nobody's pointing a gun at your head. You just don't know if you're going to have a job tomorrow or not. That's something different. And I think that fear may have driven me to do things that maybe I wouldn't have done today.
That's a really good lesson. Jacob, it's been really great hearing your story. It's very inspiring. I really appreciate it. We're absolutely rooting for you and American Woolen.
Thank you.
And look forward to having you back in a couple more years and hearing about the success of chapters 2 and 3.
Great. Thank you.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by Compass MSP.
Thanks for listening and spending some time with me today. My goal is to help build a strong manufacturing community, and it would be impossible to do without all of you.